Okay, so get this right. 29 Hanbury Street.
Okay.
You know that Hanbury Street?
Yeah.
Where Jack the Ripper,
Oh, he's drunk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But here's the thing you sent in this YouTube video.
Right.
And it doesn't just rehash the murder.
Right.
It's like stepping into a time machine.
Oh, wow.
Back to 1888, meeting the people who actually lived in this building.
Wow. Okay.
Talk about your neighborly drama, right?
Yeah.
Except, with a side of infamous murder.
Right. Well, what's so captivating about this documentary is how it uses 29 Hanbury Street as this magnifying glass on life in London's East End.
Yeah.
This isn't just a crime scene.
Right.
It's like a stage where you have this poverty, this overcrowding, and then this unimaginable horror all playing out.
And get this, right? 17 people.
Wow.
Crammed into this one tenement building.
Oh, my God.
17.
Yeah, it's a lot of people.
Can you imagine the noise, the smells,
Yeah.
just the constant presence of other people? It's the documentary makes you feel like you're right there, which is equal parts fascinating and creepy considering what we know went down.
Yeah, for sure. And the filmmakers really nailed the setting, right? This 3-story building, built back in 1740, used to house silk weavers, which gives you just a little clue about how much London had changed by the late 1800s.
Wow.
Gone were those kind of airy workrooms, chopped up into these cramped little living spaces.
So we're talking shoebox living, basically.
Yeah, basically.
This is where the documentary gets really juicy, right?
Okay.
Because we start meeting the residents of 29 Hanbury Street.
Yeah.
These are folks whose lives intersected with this dark, dark moment in history.
Right. And each resident adds just this new layer to the story.
Okay.
Take Amelia Richardson, the landlady.
Okay.
She ran a packing case business out of her cellar.
Okay.
But also held prayer meetings in her front room.
Wait, hold up.
Yeah.
She's running a business and preaching the good word all under one roof. Right.
That's quite the combo.
It was.
Was that common back then?
This
mix of commerce and piety.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to a certain resourcefulness, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
And perhaps the kind of blurred lines between your work life and your private life in a place like the East End.
Right.
But it's her son, John Richardson, who becomes a kind of pivotal character in all of this.
Right.
He didn't live there, but because of a recent break-in, he checked on the property every day.
Every day.
Little did he know how crucial his actions on the morning of the murder would become.
Talk about being at the wrong place. Well, not at the wrong time exactly, but you know what I mean? It's like these small details, these little everyday choices that suddenly become super significant in light of what we know happens next.
Yeah.
And then there are the other folks living at 29 Hanbury Street.
Right.
You've got the Hardymans running a cat's meat shop on the ground floor.
Right.
Can you even imagine the aroma?
Let's just say it was a sensory experience. Oh, I bet.
And we can't forget the Davises,
Yeah.
a family of 7 crammed into a tiny attic room.
7 people in one room.
Yeah.
Talk about knowing your family inside and out, that's for sure.
Right.
It's heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
And it was John Davis, the father,
Yeah.
who ended up stumbling upon the scene that would change everything.
Yeah.
It's eerie to think about, right?
Yeah.
You have this building,
Right.
this community just going about their Friday night, September 7th, 1888.
Right.
Residents coming and going, neighbors stopping by,
Yeah.
maybe someone taking a shortcut through the passageway.
The documentary really emphasizes how common that was back then.
Right.
People cutting through buildings, especially at night,
Yeah.
and with the front door often left unlocked.
Right.
It really highlights just how different security was in Victorian London.
It's like a city designed for socializing,
Yeah.
even if it meant sacrificing a bit of privacy.
Yeah.
Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect a brutal murder to happen. And yet
the stage was set.
Right.
The documentary does this kind of chilling job of walking us through the events of September 8th.
Okay.
Starting with John Richardson's visit at 4:45 a.m.
Right.
He was adamant that Annie Chapman's body was not in the backyard when he checked on the cellar.
Which, that totally throws a wrench into the usual timeline, right?
It does.
If we believe Richardson,
Right.
and the documentary makes a compelling case for his reliability,
Yeah.
then the murder happened much later than anyone initially thought.
Precisely.
Wow.
It casts those accounts from Albert Kadash and Elizabeth Long in a whole new light.
Right.
Did they actually see Annie Chapman?
Right.
Were they mistaken about the time, or was there someone else entirely in that backyard that morning?
It's like a game of Clue,
Right.
but with way higher stakes.
Right.
And then, of course, there's John Davis.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being him that morning, leaving for work, stepping out into that crisp autumn air, only to stumble upon that gruesome scene?
The documentary doesn't shy away from the raw emotion of that moment.
Right.
The shock, the terror.
Right.
It reminds us that this wasn't just some historical event.
Yeah.
It was a lived experience.
Yeah.
One that left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it.
Absolutely. It's impossible not to feel for those residents, especially the Davises.
Right.
Their lives were irrevocably altered by what happened that morning.
Yeah.
But what gets me is how life went on.
Right.
Even with the shadow of this horror hanging over them, they had to keep going, keep living.
They did.
It's wild to think about,
Yeah.
how 29 Hanbury Street went from just another address to this morbid tourist attraction.
It really highlights the kind of the dark side of human curiosity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The documentary mentions how some of the neighbors, right, actually started charging people to look into the murder yard from their windows.
Wow. Talk about profiting from a tragedy.
Right.
But it's it's a reminder that for some, right, life in the East End was about survival.
Right.
Any way they could manage it.
Yeah.
Still, you have to wonder about the emotional toll on everyone else.
Right.
Imagine being Mrs. Bell right next door.
Right.
Suddenly living next to a crime scene.
Right. It's easy to forget that for the people who live there, this wasn't some kind of abstract historical event.
Right.
It was terrifyingly real.
Yeah.
A stark reminder of the darkness lurking just outside their doorsteps.
Right. And speaking of reminders,
Yeah.
that letter Mrs. Hardman received,
Oh, yeah?
the one referencing the Bucks Row murder,
Right.
that adds a whole other layer of creepy, right?
I like that.
Like, was it some sick joke? Or did someone genuinely believe there was a connection between these two murders?
Right.
And then you have poor John Davis's son, right? Being mistaken for Jack the Ripper
Oh, God.
a year later.
I know.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
It's unbelievable.
It really is. And it speaks to the long shadow this event casts.
It does.
Not just on the residents of 29 Hanbury Street,
Right.
but on the entire community.
Yeah.
The fear, the suspicion.
Right.
It lingered in the air like smoke long after the fire was out.
It did. It did.
It's incredible how this one building, this one tragic event becomes this like microcosm of the whole Jack the Ripper story.
Right.
You've got the poverty, the vulnerability, the mystery,
Right.
and then this kind of enduring fascination that just won't quit.
And that's the genius of this documentary.
Yeah.
It doesn't just kind of like regurgitate the facts of the Annie Chapman murder.
Right.
It uses it as this doorway into the lives of everyday people grappling with extraordinary circumstances.
Right. We started this deep dive wanting to understand what life was like at 29 Hanbury Street.
Yep.
And we ended up with a front row seat to Victorian London.
We did.
In all its, gritty glory.
That's right. Yeah.
But like any good mystery, right, it leaves us with
more questions.
More questions than answers.
Right.
Knowing how vulnerable 29 Hanbury Street was with people constantly coming and going, right?
Right.
How did Jack the Ripper manage to commit such a brazen murder undetected?
It's the question.
Was it someone who knew the building's layout?
Right.
Someone who could blend in?
Right.
Or even more unsettling, did he have help from someone within?
Right. That is the million-dollar question.
It is.
It really is.
And it seems like no matter how closely we look, how deeply we dive, the mystery of Jack the Ripper and 29 Hanbury Street remains unsolved.